I'd like to read three short scriptures tonight, which were significant in the early days of the modern missionary movement with William Carey. The first one is by John Sutcliffe. He was speaking at the Northampton Baptist Association at their 1791 Easter meeting, and he had been the chief instigator of the concert of prayer, promoting the concert of prayer that had started in Glasgow in 1742 and been written up by Jonathan Edwards in America. He chose for the sermon at this Easter gathering for the verse 1 Kings 19:10. The Lord appears to Elijah, and the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too." It was a marvellous sermon and moved many hearts. But Andrew Fuller, a friend of Carey and benefactor to him, he spoke afterwards on Haggai chapter 1 verse 2. And his sermon has been titled "The Disaster of Delay." And he was urging his hearers to a more attentive attendance to the building of God's kingdom. This was the text he chose. "In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built." Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. "Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your panelled houses while this house remains a ruin?" And it was a tremendous time after that in the meeting. And that sermon became one of the 3 pointers that writers say stirred Carey to do his work on the inquiry, writing the inquiry. He pointed out, among many other things, that, quote, "we seem to sit down half contented that the greater part of the world should still remain in ignorance and idolatry." The meeting urged Carey to complete his inquiry. They didn't do anything. Carey wanted them to move and arrange something, a missionary society or something. But they wouldn't move. But they did urge Carey to continue writing the inquiry which he'd already started. And finally, the third text I've chosen was Carey's own text for his sermon on May the 30th, 1792. He also spoke to the association meeting. This time they were gathered together in Friar Lane Baptist Chapel in Nottingham. And he preached what has been called the Deathless Sermon on Isaiah 54 verses 2 and 3. "Sing, O barren woman, you who never bore a child, burst into song, shout for joy, you who were never in labor, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch your tent curtains wide, do not hold back, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes, for you will spread out to the right and to the left. Your descendants will dispossess nations and settle in their desolate cities. And the theme, of course, as we all well know, was expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. That was his theme. And his intimates wrote, he said he knew that of the prophet's words he lit a beacon that was to blaze for evermore, and surely they have blazed for evermore. He was indeed the father of the modern missionary movement, as we call it. And I want to say tonight that the harvest is still being reaped. Thank you.
Well, why a service here on the south coast of England in honor of a man who lived 200 years ago and, alas, by a modern generation of Christians is hardly known. A man who impacted not England itself, at least not immediately or directly, but did influence the whole of Southeast Asia. Why bother to put the spotlight on William Carey? Well, we have, I think, a privilege to thank God and to honor faithful men and women in the past, to see what they have achieved, to be challenged by their lives, and for their lives to be a corrective for ours is surely profitable. No man can really exploit the present, plan for the future, who is ignorant of the past. And that's another reason for considering William Carey. Our Lord Jesus was born in the obscure village of Bethlehem and was brought up in the equally obscure hamlet of Nazareth. He was a carpenter. It seems as though God delights in visiting the most remote spot on the earth, be it here in the United Kingdom or in the East, and taking the most nondescript type of person, filling him or her with his Spirit, and using that individual in a staggering way to change the course of Christian history. William Carey was a cobbler, born in a little village of which you've never heard, the majority of you, in Northamptonshire. And what God did through William Carey has had an effect not only on Southeast Asia, but for thinking people involved in the missionary movement throughout the decades from when he commenced his ministry right up to now. His life is an influence. There was an advert carried in the Calcutta newspaper just a year or so ago, the newspaper that circulates around the area of Bengal in North India, and it simply said, "Cobblers wanted." It didn't have the idea of attracting men like William Carey. But another reason why we should be studying his life is because when you understand what Carey stood for, then you will appreciate my using that newspaper cutting as a pun and saying, there is a carpenter from Nazareth who still wants cobblers today. You will not understand much about William Carey unless you grasp a little bit about the sort of life that people in this country enjoyed, or more often than not, endured 200 years ago. To think away 2 centuries is not easy. Let me help you. At the time when William Carey was a lad, our native people here in the United Kingdom and in what was increasingly being known as the United States of America, but was before known just as America, the USA only became the USA as a result of the War of Independence. There had been some remarkable movements of God's Spirit. One of the great brains that America ever gave the world in the sovereignty of God was a man called Jonathan Edwards. Here in this country, born in a public house in Gloucester, was a little lad who had a cast in his eye that would always make him the butt end of those who go in for sarcasm. His name was Whitfield, George Whitfield. George Whitfield and Jonathan Edwards were going to get together in the providence of God, but not on their own. They would also influence two brothers by the name of John and Charles Wesley. In America, there had been an outpouring of the Spirit of God. It was known as the Great Awakening. And that movement of God's Spirit affected the United Kingdom. In France, there was a bloody revolution. And it looked as though England would go exactly the same way. There would be blood, feet high, several feet high, on the streets or several feet deep on the streets of London, or so it would seem. But in a most remarkable fashion, God used these men to proclaim the gospel, not only in America, but also here. And it was the afterglow of that ministry which gave the sort of ethos in which William Carey was born. David Brainerd is a man of whom you should know. He was a great missionary in the United States of America. He took the gospel to the Indians in North America. He died quite young. He was actually the son-in-law of Jonathan Edwards, and Jonathan Edwards wrote an account of his life. The account of Jonathan Edwards, the account of David Brainerd's life written by Edwards fell ultimately into the hands of William Carey. But I go too quickly. Not only was there a spiritual awakening and a change in the religious temperature in the West, there was also in our country a change in terms of our outlook on the world. Obviously, 200 years ago, such a thing as a motor car or an aeroplane had never been thought of, and the world seemed to be utterly inaccessible. But if you go down the main road here and turn right at the little island before you get into Montague Precinct, you will find a shop by the name of Thomas Cook. Captain Cook had quite an influence on the conceptions of British people as to how the world, even in the 17th century, was beginning to narrow. He'd engaged in his remarkable voyages. He'd gone to the Pacific Islands, he had mapped New Zealand, and he had begun to demonstrate to people who wanted to make a quick buck or two that actually you could get from A to B. You could actually arrive in India if you allowed yourselves 5 months. And not only could you tour India, at least a little, you could establish a business. And one of the great business houses of Britain was to develop in India, known as the East Indian Company. When William Carey heard about Captain Cook, he was terribly excited. He read his book, The Last Voyage of Captain Cook, and he thought to himself, if businessmen can go all over the world making money, isn't it about time that Christian people also risked their lives to make converts for Jesus Christ? Well, it would seem to be a reasonable thing to do, were it not for the fact that politically in India, things were changing very rapidly, and there had been attempts to reach Indians with the gospel in the 1st century. I mean, the Apostle Thomas, according to tradition, had actually gone to India. There is a denomination to this day known as the Bartoma Church in South India. And the political situation in India and the business interests of the British East India Company didn't actually create an environment which would welcome any further attempt to reach Indians with the gospel of Jesus Christ. In fact, one erstwhile Roman Catholic who happened to stray into India in the 16th century sent a letter back to his Jesuit headquarters, and he said this, I quote, "The natives are terribly wicked and can never be expected to embrace Christianity." So that hardly gave any degree of optimism for those who perhaps might think that we ought to move from this country, those who are Christians in that time, and start to spread the gospel of Jesus in other lands. But there was one other great obstacle, not a political obstacle, so much as a theological obstacle, as to why people rarely engaged in missionary enterprise. Jonathan Edwards was a great theologian, as I've mentioned, and he and George Whitefield, not so much the Wesleys, were very indebted to a group of men known as the Puritans. Now, the Puritans were great Bible teachers and preachers. You had them in the United States of America. You had them in this country. And they followed the teaching of John Calvin. Calvin was a great theologian, a Frenchman. And he and Martin Luther had changed the course of European history. John Calvin had taught that there is an elect for whom Jesus died, a great innumerable company of people from every tribe and every nation, and by the irresistible grace of God, they would be saved. And the idea in England, as they wrongly misunderstood John Calvin, was this: that because God had decreed that an innumerable company of people would be saved, then let God get on with doing the work of evangelism. It wasn't for us, it is for God and for His Spirit. The Spirit had been poured out on the early church on the day of Pentecost. They had been given other languages in which to preach the gospel. And according to tradition, the disciples had compartmentalized the world, and they'd gone off into their own little slot, and they preached with the languages that God had given them. And the idea was this: that the mandate to preach the gospel left by our Lord Jesus Christ to the church was to the church of the first century alone. And was if the gospel is to be taken to any other country on a worldwide basis, shall we say, in the 17th or in the 18th century, then there would have to be another Pentecost. So this is the sort of theological climate in which William Carey is raised. God will do the work of evangelism without the help of enthusiasts. Now, that to you and me sounds absolutely extraordinary. But as I say, you've got to think away 200 years. You've got to put yourself in the atmosphere in which William Carey was born. Not only the international, not only the political one, but even more importantly, the theological one. You know, there's a wonderful verse in the New Testament which speaks of the way that our God has a surprising tendency, when He determines to do something remarkable, to take someone who at the human level is utterly incompetent. God chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chooses the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to do what? To bring about His purposes. So God is going to bring a seismic shift, a dramatic correction in the theological understanding of the church in the West. And He's going to do it through the life of a little boy born in the little-known village of Paulsbury in Northamptonshire. A lad whose parents were working class, weavers actually by trade. A lad who knew great penury, great poverty when he was just in his early years. A lad who naturally was disposed towards becoming a gardener, but found because of a sensitive skin that if he exposed his skin to the sunshine, it blistered. And therefore he took up the task of being apprenticed to a cobbler. Do you know, some of the greatest minds have never been trained minds. They've never gone to college. They've never gone to university. Some of the great preachers have never gone to any seminary at all. God has a way of bringing out the latent gifts in an individual who's sold out for himself so that he or she is not impoverished by not having had a professional education. I've seen that so many times, especially in Southeast Asia and in Africa. William Carey not only became an apprenticed cobbler, but he also discovered a love for books. He also found that he was a natural linguist. And sometimes when he was cutting leather and repairing shoes, he would be working his way through a French grammar or a Dutch grammar. And by the time he was just in his mid-teens, he had imbibed the language of the French and also the Dutch, and had got a working knowledge of New Testament Greek. God has a way even of fashioning the experiences of village boys. He came into contact with a man called John Waugh. William was brought up in the established Church of England. In those days, to be a nonconformist was really socially to slip a few notches. But John Waugh, he was a nonconformist, and he started to tell Carey about the Lord. And he invited William Carey to a prayer meeting. The king at that particular time had called a day of prayer because, well, we were having so much trouble in the American colonies. You know what the Americans are like? They were really giving us great difficulty. And so the king called a day of prayer, and John Waugh invited William to go to his nonconformist meeting house. And there William heard an address from a verse in Hebrews, "Let us go forth unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach." William Carey was introduced to an enthusiastic, dynamic faith that he hadn't come across before in such a degree. And ultimately, not only did he become a Christian, but he also became a nonconformist. It was discovered fairly soon that William Carey could not only lift a hammer and get a nail into the right place, but he also had a way with words. Not only in being able to break down the syntax of a foreign language, but he had an ability to explain the gospel. And this village boy becomes a village pastor. He's invited to preach in a place called Moulton. And he does quite well. So he goes to Olney, another village in Northamptonshire, where there's an established Baptist church, and he really is looking for ordination. So they give him a trial sermon. And the congregation thought that the word trial was the best way to describe it, and suggested that he should come back in about a year or so and they'd test his gift again. Do you know that Campbell Morgan was turned down for the Methodist ministry when he first applied? Do you remember how one of the great missionaries to China, Gladys Aylward, was turned down by the China Inland Mission? God has a way of getting his way in the lives of individuals who are not reckoned to have giftings by some of the people who are judged to have the ability to distinguish between gift and no gift at all. So William, unabashed by being turned down for ordination, nonetheless continues to preach at Moulton, and he can't earn enough money as a preacher, so he retains his art as a cobbler. And then there's an opportunity to to share what he's learned of languages and what he knows in terms of general knowledge with the local schoolboys. And he becomes a school teacher, and he's good at geography because, well, actually, William Carey, before Leslie Browley and before Patrick Johnson, he worked on the original copy of Operation World. He made himself a globe out of leather. And as he's teaching geography, he uses this primitive globe. He's also got a leather cloth that sort of acts as a blackboard, and he's got a map of the world. And he works out statistically how many people live where. He does his reading. He's a voracious reader, and he culls his information. And ere long, he has got more knowledge of the countries of the world and their number and their religious tendencies probably than anyone else. And the story is that when William Carey would spin his globe and point out India to his boys, with tears in his eyes he would say, and most of them are Hindu and they don't know Jesus. William moves from being a village pastor to a city pastor. He goes not to Sheffield, he goes to Leicester, where he makes friends with a number of ministers, comes into contact with a great man by the name of Andrew Fuller. And the ministers in that town, as in our town, they met quite regularly, and sometimes suggestions were taken as to what the subject matter ought to be for discussion. William Carey, he offers this suggestion: whether the command to preach the gospel given to the apostles was not obligatory on all succeeding ministers to the end of the world. In other words, why don't we take the gospel to other countries? Now again, you're thinking away 200 years. This is a shocking thing to suggest. This is like lobbing a hand grenade. Well, they didn't even have those 200 years ago. This is like firing an arrow from your bow and sending it into the heart of the chairman, whose reaction was something like this: if the Lord would make windows in heaven, might such a thing be? But William Carey is a controversialist, inasmuch as he's prepared to cling to his convictions, not only the gospel to Olney, not only the gospel to Moulton, not only the gospel to Leicester, but what about the gospel to the South Pacific, to the islands there? In fact, he's so concerned about getting the gospel out that some people don't think he's a proper Calvinist. He's really an Arminian. He believes that people can actually decide for themselves as to whether they respond. It's nothing to do with the eternal decree of God. Well, what do you do if you're confused? Or if you're confusing people? You go to Birmingham. And there in Birmingham, he met a man who listened to what he had to say, who had a shilling or two, as often they do as they come from Birmingham. And he gave some money, I think it was £10 to William, in order to put his thoughts down. And thus William produced this little booklet. And I'll now give you a shortened version of the title: An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. And he shares his booklet with the friends in his little fraternity of ministers in Leicester. And the day comes when he's invited actually to preach the sermon. Not in Leicester, but in nearby Nottingham. And he turns to Isaiah chapter 52, and he starts to preach from the verses that have just been read to us about strengthening your cords, about extending your tent. The whole idea is of Israel in an expansionist frame, being empowered by God to seize territory that really belongs to it. And Carey thinks of the church in terms of Israel, and he pours the whole of his soul into this verse, and the atmosphere becomes electric, and it moves to a pinnacle as he pleads with his men: attempt great things for God, expect great things from God. And 1 year later, they're still talking about that sermon. And when 10 years have elapsed, that sermon has been etched indelibly on the memories of many of the people who were present. For that is preaching. Preaching is not a carefully prepared speech. Preaching is declaring the heart of God with the unction of the Spirit in such a way it makes an impact. But immediate impact can fade, and William Carey is upset as he says to his friend Fuller, "Is there nothing again to be done, sir? Are we going to defer to the next meeting this suggestion twice put that we particular Baptists ought to federate together to send men out into the furthermost parts of the world to proclaim the gospel?" I don't suppose many of you have ever heard of Kettering, or if you have, it's only just in a fleeting fashion. Do you know that Northamptonshire town should be blessed as far as the history of Christian missions are concerned, inasmuch as within 5 months of Carey preaching his deathless sermon, a group of men came together. They were all under 40 years of age, and they federated to bring about an organization called the Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel among the Heathen. Today we know it as the Baptist Missionary Society, though here their theology would be completely Calvinistic. And they put their money where their mouth was. They passed their snuff box around, as some of you saw in the film on Sunday evening. Half a Guinness subscription was suggested, and that was a lot of money in those days. The grand total was £13, 12 shillings and 6 pence. And that becomes the sum of money to be looked after by this mission society, which will launch into Southeast Asia not only Carey, but ultimately dozens, if not hundreds of men. William Carey's great-grandson says, Kettering had no notion. It had immortalized itself during the night. Its line was to go out through all the earth and its influence to the end of the world. God chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and within his providence, God can bring across the path of a village boy, now a city preacher, a man who has contacts in India and who can start to tell Carey a little bit about the need there. A man by the name of Dr. John Nelson, Dr. John Thompson. He'd been in India himself. He was a godly man, a Christian man, but he was a bit of a blunderer. And he tells Carey about India and the needs in Calcutta and Bengal, and Carey, who'd been thinking in terms of Tahiti and the South Pacific Islands as a targeting point, now begins to think in terms of India. And he contacts his colleagues who are the founders, 5 men who are the founders of this missionary society, and he suggests that they ought to put their sights on the subcontinent. And they do so. Now I need to write a little bit of shorthand. Eventually, Thomas and Carey find themselves as passengers aboard a ship, the Earl of Oxford, which was going to leave the Thames and sail towards India. But unfortunately, the ship cannot go because, well, Thomas cannot handle money very well. He may be a good surgeon, but he's a rotten financier, and his debtors have caught up with him, and the captain ejects him. And in one sense, that was a great blessing for William Carey, because I failed to mention thus far Dorothy. When Dorothy hears that her husband is thinking of going to India, she is convinced that it is a foolish thing, as indeed is William Carey's father. You see, Dorothy, far from going to India, has never even seen the sea. Well, Carey can't travel, can't sail to India on the Earl of Oxford, because of Thomas's problems. But it so happens that there's a Danish ship, the Crown Princess Maria. And the possibility is that he could get aboard this ship. And maybe his wife, who is now pregnant with their third child, she could change her mind and come along. For the idea was for William and his eldest son, Felix, to travel with Thomas to India alone. He goes back to Leicester, and Thomas uses his influence. And ere long, Dorothy, within a matter of 24 hours, is convinced. And she decides that provided her sister can come with her, she'll set off to India. That was a very courageous decision for any village woman to make. Imagine if you were her 200 years ago and suddenly your husband, who when you married him was just an ordinary cobbler in a village, comes to you and says, we're going to India. And in addition, you know that India has been barred as far as missionaries are concerned because the East India Company, run partly by the British government, certainly by politicians who are connected with the government and businessmen, they have said that the Hindus are not to be upset by the preaching of a religion that's alien to them. Well, Dorothy goes along with Kitty, and on board this ship, which takes 5 months, all but a couple of days to arrive in Calcutta, Carey is quite delirious with joy when he's not seasick. And he writes, I'm very desirous that my sons may pursue the same work as I'm going to do. I mean, here is faith. I intend to bring up one of my boys in the study of Sanskrit and another in Persian. May God give them fitting grace for the work. Well, in terms of optimism, he really ought to get a prize, did he not? He spent those weeks in his cabin with Thompson learning Bengal so that when he arrived in India, they nearly didn't, incidentally, the boat virtually was in danger of sinking just off the Cape. But he was taught Bengali to some degree, at any rate. It took some 3 months before they had a sight of another vessel. And as they're trying to get into Calcutta, the tide is against them. And Carey, ever one for getting a spiritual lesson out of an ordinary experience, pens in his diary, we Christians have to work against wind and tide. Eventually, he lands in Bengal. Somebody has said that remarkable day, November the 11th, 1793, was the occasion when, in contrast, to the English who came to India as merchants to gain wealth, then as warriors to gain land, now there is Carey, who comes with a nobler spirit, entering Calcutta to do India good. Well, God does not always allow an easy pathway for his children, does he? I mean, the path of our Lord was not exactly strewn with primroses, it was stained with blood. And it was our Lord Jesus who said, let a man examine himself, and then let him take up his cross and follow me. C.S. Lewis in Oxford once said that God operates with severe mercies, and the severity of God's mercy is experienced by William Carey, particularly within the first 6 years of being in India. In fact, in the opening months, financially, he's broke. Thomas has completely underestimated just how much it would cost to keep him and his wife and the children in that land. Carey is immediately in difficulty. And then Dorothy, his wife, and Felix, his eldest son, they go sick with dysentery. And 5-year-old Peter, who within a matter of months has got some grasp of Bengali, it's amazing how kids can pick up a language, he gets a fever and dies. Evangelistically, India is not turning to the gospel. I mean, this is what Carey was hoping. Once you preach, they'll come flocking. They didn't come flocking. He says, over 20 miles I've published Christ's name. Often I walk 20 miles in a night. Never was a people more willing to hear, nor more slow to understand. And then he says in his diary, but the social cost to obey the Christian gospel is so terrible. The severity of the mercies of God to Carey increase. It's not the incessant fight against mosquitoes or grappling with the root and syntax of languages in the ceaseless struggle to reduce them to written form. It's not the hostility of the British authorities who actually won't let him stay in the Calcutta area but treat him as a vagabond. It's the deteriorating condition of his sickly wife who never shared his missionary zeal, preferring the shelter of Northamptonshire villages to being in the hinterland at the back of Calcutta. What happens when your wife becomes so volatile and her mind so darkened that a spirit of suspicion grows within her and she accuses you of an adulterous relationship with every woman who crosses your path? That, for years, is what William Carey had to put up with. There was never a stain on his character morally. It was his poor wife sinking further and further into her disease. Thomas writes to Carey and says he does not know how he could cope himself with such a condition, but he believes that Carey will be given grace by God to cope. And cope Carey does. And I'm very grateful, as I say, to Dr. James Beck for taking the underside of the Carey saga and looking at Dorothy Carey's life and also William Carey's treatment of his wife, and coming to the conclusion as a medically qualified as well as a theologically qualified writer that actually William in the circumstances probably did the best that he could for his wife. For had they returned to Leicester, she would have been placed in the asylum in that town, and you probably know something of the rough-hewn way in which people were treated in those days when they had mental illnesses. God chooses the foolish things of the world. God chooses the weak things of the world. God sometimes allows providentially the severity of mercies so that over against this backcloth he can show that what is achieved can only be understood in terms of his Spirit working through an individual. And so it increasingly was with William Carey. He starts to receive some help from home. Communications, of course, have been very poor. It took 2 years before he heard from his executive committee back in Leicester, not because of their lack of diligence in writing, there just were not the communication facilities. Eventually, other people come out. William Ward, a young man who William Carey years ago in London, walking towards the monument, says to Carey, I am a printer. He worked for a paper in Derby. One day, Mr. Carey, I will come out and help you. And William Ward does come out. And another man, Joshua Marshman. And together, these become what will be known as the Serampore Trio, a triumvirate, who form what someone has called the battle line for the whole of Asia. You see, when the British authorities were so negative towards Carey, God softened the heart of the Danish authorities, who had a little island of territory north of Calcutta, and the Danish king and the authorities there allow William Carey to settle at a place called Serampore. And Serampore becomes the nerve center of William Carey's operation. He's had so many problems, so many difficulties. A lesser man might well have given up. But with the associates of his now well established at Serampore, they begin to do what William Carey is good at. In those difficult years, he's mastered the Bengali language, and he has in his neat handwriting translated the whole of the New Testament scriptures. And at the right time, William Ward finds himself in Serampore. And surprise, surprise, in Calcutta, a new printing press that has hardly been used is made available at the price of £46. And they move it from Calcutta to Serampore. And there commences one of the most remarkable miracles in the history of Christian printing enterprise that there has ever been, with these three men working to get the languages of India into a written form and then translating the Bible into those languages, so that by the end of William Carey's life, there is hardly a major language in India that either doesn't have the New Testament and the Old Testament, or at least part of the Gospels. And you wonder, how could one man achieve so much? But you see, Carey is a man who is moved by the Spirit of God. He's not only in the flow of the Spirit in terms of his own life, but the current of the Spirit is round and about him and bringing across his path the people that he needs and the situations that are necessary for his work to be done. William Ward pens in his journal, thinking of his printing opportunities, "Unto me, who am less than the least of all the saints, has this grace been given, that I should print for the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ." To labor for 6 or 7 years without a convert is difficult. All credit to some of the retired missionaries in the Tab who labored for years in North Africa without seeing such. They, more than anyone, will be able to enter into Carey's joy when a man called Krishna Pal, the first Hindu to respond to the gospel, on December the 28th, the year 1800, is immersed in the Hooghly River, which flows into the Ganges, professing faith in Jesus Christ. And Carey writes, "Yesterday was a day of great joy. I had the happiness of desecrating the Ganges by baptizing the first Hindu convert and my son Felix." The authorities start to smile kindly now on Carey. You see, Calcutta has become quite a center for the British Raj. India belongs to Britain. Doesn't the world belong to Britain? Was not God an Englishman in the 18th, 19th century? That seemed to be the case. Why send our best young men who are part of the empire living in India? Why return them to the motherland, to Eton and to Oxford? Why not have our own college, our own university? So Fort William College is established in Calcutta. But any decent college must have a professor of languages. And we don't have an Englishman who speaks Bengal or who can handle Sanskrit. And up pops, you've guessed, William Carey, the untrained, uneducated village lad from the back of beyond in Northamptonshire. And he is made Professor of Languages in this new college, albeit they only pay him half what they pay the rest of the professors, because he's a Baptist and not Church of England. But for Carey, the finances that he has received when he was working in the fields and getting dyes and so on and so forth, they're now supplemented. They are now replaced by the monies that he gets from going down the river 3 days every week and teaching at this college. And his colleagues, Marshman and Ward, they are men with vision. They encourage Carey. They say, yes, you go and do this because of the contacts that this will make for us. And so Professor William Carey continues preaching and teaching, completing the whole of the Bengali Bible, which is then presented to His Majesty in the United Kingdom. I am greatly pleased, says the King, that any of my subjects should be employed in such a manner as this. And William Carey writes, if we are given another 15 years, we hope to translate and print the Bible in all the chief languages of Hindustan. We have fixed our eyes on this goal. The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall perform this. And that was one of his poor days. Because later on, he is determining how he will turn into written form and publish, as a result, the Chinese language. For Serampore is only 600 miles from China. And William Carey sees Serampore as being the headquarters, the nerve center, not just for the evangelization of India, but for the evangelization of the whole of Southeast Asia. Attempt great things for God. Expect great things for God. Did you know that William Carey's influence, in effect, brought about the birth, or was a contributory factor in the birth of the British and foreign Bible Society? And so I could go on. Here is Carey with great joy on the one hand, yet his poor demented wife suffering on the other. 1808, she dies. She goes home to be with the Lord. That mind which has been so curiously torn apart, those thoughts which have been so undisciplined, this woman who has been at the mercy of this mental disease is released from it all. And who could not but read the mind of God and say that the entry of Dorothy Carey into the immediate presence of the Lord would have been great and glorious, as she begins to understand something of why it was that God allowed her to pass through what she did, so that no one could explain the phenomenon of the evangelization of that part of India without having a recourse to the fact that this must be of God. For William Carey on his own could certainly not have coped. Carey was to marry again. And eventually at Serampore, he and his colleagues would found a college which would be open not just for Christians, but also for thoughtful Hindu and Muslim. Serampore College, which would have a Christian orientation, but which would also be a further means of building a bridge between the Hindu and the Islamic community. And this college is developed by Carey within the last 10 or 15 years of his life. And then, as I point out in my handed out outline, in the year 1834, the trumpet sounds and the chariot comes, and William Carey, the diminutive cobbler from Northamptonshire, whose skin was at one stage so sensitive it could not stand the rays of the sun, is taken into the presence of the Son of God. And when he's buried, a memorial is raised with the inscription, which he himself has decreed to be chiseled into the stone. William Carey, a wretched, poor and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall. Well, that hardly does justice to an account of the life of Carey. But now we must stand back, and from the vantage of the 20th century, we must try some sort of evaluation. What does Carey teach missionaries today? What should Carey be teaching local churches today? What is it that Carey represents in his life? And my suggestion is that you cannot just understand Carey in terms of his own definition of a man who was just a plodder and had a degree of persistency. There was that, but there is more. You see, William Carey was fashioned in his conversion on the anvil of Calvinism. Expressed another way, he believed in the sovereignty of God. He believed that what God decrees, he will bring about. But Carey acknowledges this in a moderate fashion, in a balanced way. He writes to one of his friends, there are 3 things you should know. 1, there is your duty to preach the gospel to every creature. 2, remember that God has declared that his word shall accomplish that for which it is sent. 3, that he can easily remove the present seemingly formidable obstacle as we can remove the smallest particle of dust. That really is a wonderful statement. God can go and blow away the intransigence of the British East India Company. God can warm the heart of the Kingdom of Denmark. God can bring the right people and the right equipment at the right time for William Carey, and even bring the assistance of Mrs. Marshman to look after his beloved Dorothy, when back in England she would have been placed in the confines of some asylum. You can only understand Carey if you understand Carey's doctrine of the absolute sovereignty of God. What is more, and I speak to missionary friends who hear this tape and honor you for your ministry, you can only understand Carey if you recognize what Carey believed as the terror of the Lord. The Apostle Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, says, knowing the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. There is within the theological circles in which we find ourselves in the latter part of the 20th century, the discussion as to whether punishment in eternity is eternal. William Carey believed that it was. He believed in the judgment of God. He believed that to die outside Christ was to die in a fearful condition. And that was one of the 2 stimuli that compel him not only to go to India, but stay in India. This is the reason why Carey in his evangelism is not slovenly. He has adopted a pattern of evangelism. He will draw concentric circles around Serampore of 200 miles, and within each circle there will be a European missionary, and working alongside the European missionary there will be Indian Christians, and eventually the whole church will be Indianized in terms of the evangelistic mandate. These things have to be done efficiently because the destiny of millions of people is at stake. Carey is prompted by his fear of millions of people toppling into eternity the wrong side of God's grace. Moreover, William Carey will teach us something about what it means to love Christ. Again, it's the Apostle Paul who says, the love of Christ constraineth me. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14, the authorized version of our Bible. You cannot read the diaries of William Carey. You cannot read the letters that he sends home, which I have here, to his family, to his colleagues, to the executive mission of the particular Baptist society in its headquarters in Kettering, without realizing that this is a man who is baptized in the love of Christ. He thinks of Jesus. He's Jesus-centric. He's Christocentric. Everything that he does, he relates to, his allegiance to the Lord Jesus Christ and his gospel. The love of Christ. Christ has said, go. We must go. The theological corrective has been made, and the church must be as quickly as it can about the business in which it should have been involved centuries ago, taking the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially to people in the subcontinent of India, which in those days, I remind you, included Pakistan and the present Bangladesh. The love of Christ causes Carey to write back home and say, look, in 1810 in Cape Town, let's call together a world conference of missionaries. Let's not just evangelize India. Let's not just evangelize the subcontinent. Let's not just translate the Bible into Chinese. Let's bring all who are involved in missions together and plan for the evangelization of the world. 1810, Cape Town. Well, 100 years was to elapse before such a conference did occur, not in Cape Town, but in Edinburgh. Carey was a man before his time, a man in advance of anyone else. The love of Christ constrained him. But the reason why I love Carey, and I've virtually lived with this man, I mean that in terms of dosing myself in his writings for these last 5 months, for these last 5 weeks, 2 or 3 of which were spent in India. One of the reasons why I love Carey is because within his creedal statement is not just his concept of the sovereignty of God and his acknowledgement of the awfulness of dying without Christ and his love of Christ. It's a concern for the dignity of man. Carey believes that man is born in the image of God. Therefore, if a woman is forced onto a funeral pyre and dies a most terrible death, because this is Hindu custom, then you have to protest and say this is wrong. And if they won't listen to you in Parliament, then you keep going back and back and back to the British authorities and say, use your might, use your influence. And it's William Wilberforce who takes up the cudgels for William Carey, and pressure is placed upon the government to relent and to declare sati, as it is known, as being a crime that would bring the death penalty. It's William Carey who pressurizes and is then given a brief by the British government authorities in Calcutta to check on the number of kids who are being offered to the Indian god Shiva in the tributaries of the Ganges. And that is declared an illegal practice. It's William Carey who pleads that the leper colonies shall be treated in a more humane fashion and the residents there cared for. It's William Carey who takes up the cudgels against the curse of India, its caste system. You see, down in the south of India, there had been missionaries and there had been churches established. And because the caste system was so riddled in India, it was allowed in those churches. And as a result, the most terrible situations occurred. And Carey said, no. When an Indian becomes a Christian, he loses caste. And William Carey writes to his son Felix, who goes ultimately as a missionary to Burma, and he says, if you come across a Hindu Brahmin, if you come across a Roman Catholic priest, you give them the respect that they deserve. William Carey is again in advance of his time as he honors the natives as being his equals. William Carey not only believes in the dignity of man, he believes in the pursuit of truth. You see, the Bible tells you that ultimately all truth is traceable back to God. The reason why William Carey will learn Sanskrit and will actually use his presses for the printing of some of the philosophies of the Hindi-speaking people is so that he can bridge a gap, he can make a bridge between their learning and his understanding, because Carey believes that all true truth will lead you back to God. And again, he's way in advance of his time. He believes that the printed page will be a means of educating Indians, and therefore he'll found schools, he'll found a newspaper, he'll find magazines, educational journals. 31 million pages of the Bible came off the presses at Sargent. 212,000 different items were published by that triumvirate. And finally, Carey believed that the natural world in which he lived, in its best, is an expression of the perfection of God. He liked to have been a gardener. He finished up as a cobbler. But when he got to India, he was not only a missionary, he became the leading botanist and horticulturalist and wrote some of the most amazing books in this whole area in the realm of nature, because he believed that when he considered the stars and the sun and the handiwork of God, he was getting a visual aid as to who God is and what God's purposes are. Such as William Carey. Will we see the like of a man like that again? Well, I do believe that we are seeing the like of Careys. You never really appreciate them until 50 or 100 years have passed. God has his Careys. God has his Gladys Aylwards. God continues to take the weak things of this world to confound the things that are mighty. God continues to choose the lowly things of this world and the things that are despised in order to achieve his purposes. So at the end, the final conclusion is, it is all of God. William Carey recognized his total indebtedness to the Lord. In his estimation, he was nothing but an ordinary man, a plodder. But if you go to Westminster Abbey on Sunday next, and I'm not inviting you to, you will find on the lectern there, from which the lesson is read, chiseled into the woodwork, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. The Church of England had the grace to acknowledge the Baptist cobbler from Northamptonshire. I said I'd finish at 9. I have, but we'll still sing a hymn. Facing a task unfinished that drives us to our knees, a need that undiminished rebukes our slothful ease. 126. We're going to stand and sing. We're taking an offering. If you're not prepared for this, then let it go. I promised some Indian evangelists that I was with, at least their leader, that I would try to help them have some bicycles for their evangelism in mid-India next year, and this offering will be used towards that purpose. Bicycles in India cost around £40 a time.